In this second screencast, we'll consider neurons and also the nerve action potential. So one of our learning aims at the beginning was for us to tell you that neurons are the functional units of the nervous system. Before we get on to describing neurons in detail, just for completeness, we'll tell you about non-neuronal cells. So the central nervous system obviously has two major types of cells, neurons being the functional units that we're going to tell you quite a lot of information about, but also these non-neuronal cells. And there are four major types of non-neuronal cells, sometimes called glial cells. So glial comes from an old word that just means glue. So the idea is that these glial cells glue the central nervous system together and maybe act as support for neurons. There are four, as I said, four main types of non-neuronal cells: astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and epidermal cells. So astrocytes are so named because they're star-shaped. They've got a star-shaped appearance, star-shaped morphology. They perform a supportive function for central nervous system neurons, and in particular they contribute to the blood-brain barrier. Oligodendrocytes form myelin sheaths around axons in the central nervous system. We'll talk about myelin later on. If we're dealing with myelination within the central nervous system, it's provided by these oligodendrocytes. Microglia are important for an immune function within the central nervous system, so they eat foreign cells or phagocytose them within the central nervous system, much like different cells in the immune system do in the peripheral nervous system. Epidermal cells, again, just for completeness, are epithelial cells which we find within the central nervous system, and as it says here, they possess these small hair-like structures called microvilli, which are important to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid, which we talked about in the first screencast, around the central nervous system. So really just take-home message is that we're going to focus in these lectures on neurons as the functional units of the nervous system, but there are other non-neuronal cells which are also important. Having said that, we'll focus on neurons. So neurons or nerve cells have become highly specialized to serve these two primary functions detailed here. So firstly, they're important in the rapid transmission of information within the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and the integration of information from many sources. So we'll see what this latter integration term means as we go through the screencasts. As probably with a lot of physiology, the anatomy of the physiological unit, in this case the neuron, is directly related to its function. So let's consider the anatomy of a typical neuron, in this case a spinal motor neuron. Central nervous system contains over 1 billion neurons. All of them have this basic structure, or this typical structure. So with things on here that are important, this is the cell body or the soma. There is one major axon which transmits information, and numerous tree-like dendrites which receive information. So dendrites receive information from other neurons, and from a physiological point of view, that's called convergence of information, neuronal information. The way that they do this is by contacting from one synapse to another via what we call presynaptic terminals. Again, we'll talk about these in detail as we go through the lectures. Around about 80% of presynaptic terminals form on dendrites, so they're said to be dendritic. The other 20% form on the cell body, are said to be somatic. The axon, as I said earlier, transmits information, usually one axon coming out from the cell body, transmits information to other neurons or sometimes non-neuronal cells. So an example here will be at the neuromuscular junction where the axon feeds information not onto another neuron but onto a motor end plate. Again, more information about this as we go on. So this is a diagram maybe that you'll hopefully get used to seeing. It's a basic diagram taken, I think, from the Pocock and Richards textbook. Shows you the nice anatomy, if you like, of neural communication. This is again our cell body, our soma, dendrites. This is our axon. There are important areas we'll talk about. The axon hillock, sometimes called the axon initial segment, is where nerve action potential, which we'll talk about next, arises. Information transmits down this axon to presynaptic terminals where neurotransmitter is released. This is the first probably slide that gives you some information about the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is something that wraps around the axon and helps to speed the action potential down through down the axon to these terminal branches. The gaps in the myelin sheath, which we'll also talk about, are called nodes of Ranvier, and they're important for allowing the nerve action potential to jump down the axon and to invade these terminal branches. We talked about convergent information in the dendrites. There is also a divergence of information through these small branches that come off the axon called the axon collaterals. So what this means is that information passing from the cell body to the terminal branches can also pass through these axon collaterals, and it just allows us to transmit information over a wider area via this divergence of neuronal information. So if we summarise organisation, structure of neurons, and then we'll go on to talk about the action potential. So the nervous system has been divided, as you've seen hopefully, into the CNS and the peripheral nervous system. We'll talk about the peripheral nervous system as we go through the next few slides. Central nervous system contains grey matter and white matter, which can be picked up on things like MRI scanning. The grey matter is the nerve cell bodies, the white matter are these myelinated nerve axons, and again we'll tell you a little bit more about myelin as we go through. The neurons are the functional unit of the nervous system. They have two processes, these dendrites, which receive convergent information, single axon, which transmits information via divergent signaling via these axon collaterals. Okay, like I said, we're going to break this up into 5 main parts. Maybe they don't fall nicely into 15 minute screencasts, but we'll do the screencast in about 15-minute segments, so that you can pick up the information as we go along. So this is the second part of the neurophysiology content, and what we'll do in the first, or for the remainder of this screencast, is introduce you to the nerve action potential, and then we'll finish off by talking a little bit about how we can do some calculations and then go on to the role of myelin. So neurons are excitable cells and signal use something called action potentials, and we're going to tell you about the nerve action potential now. So this is what a nerve action potential looks like, and maybe if we just spend a little bit of time describing this in a little bit more detail. So essentially our nerves, neurons are sitting at what we call a resting potential of around about minus 70 millivolts. So at rest, our nerves are sitting around about minus 70. If we inject some stimulating current, what happens is that we eventually, if we inject enough current, so maybe this lower bar here corresponds to this first green measurement here, the first green potential, this second bar to the second green potential. Both of these green potentials have amplified a full action potential. This third bar here goes above a threshold value and a full action potential fires, goes up to about plus 50 millivolts, then quickly returns back past rest, has this overshoot period, and then perhaps returns to resting potential. So this whole sequence of events here is called the nerve action potential. If we go from -70 up towards 0 and plus 50 millivolts, that's called a depolarization. Conversely, coming back in the other direction is called repolarization, sometimes called a hyperpolarization. So if you see hyperpolarization, it's just another name for repolarization. So depolarization in that direction, up towards firing in positive values. Repolarization or hyperpolarization in this direction here. And hopefully what we'll see on the next few slides are some ion channels that are responsible for these changes in potential. So the first term to appreciate in terms of the action potential is something called an equilibrium potential. We'll see that there are different ions that set the different phases, the inward and outward phase of an action potential, and those are dictated by something called the ion's equilibrium potential. So the potential at which the tendency of an ion to move down its concentration gradient is exactly balanced by the membrane potential is called the equilibrium potential. And each ion that's involved has its own equilibrium potential, and we'll show you how to calculate those over the next few slides. Equilibrium potential is calculated by something called the Nernst equation. Nernst was a physiologist who originally set this equation up so that we can calculate the equilibrium potential for different ions. Generation of the nerve action potential is dependent on the pre-existing resting membrane potential. So we saw that the resting membrane potential usually around about -70 and hopefully -70 millivolts. And we'll see the reason for that when we look at the main ions that set the resting membrane potential. The resting membrane potential is calculated from the sum of all the permeate ions, and this is the Nernst equation. So first of all, don't go frightened by this. We won't expect you to be able to repeat that at part 1 stage in an examination. What we would do though is expect you to understand what these different terms mean. So I'll tell you what the different terms mean. Although it does look slightly complicated, actually, hopefully you'll see over the next couple of slides, this can be reduced to quite an easier equation, if you like. And the reason for that is because a lot of these terms are constant values. So essentially, things like the R is the gas constant, T is the absolute temperature in Kelvin, F is another constant, the Faraday constant, and Z is the charge on the ion. So if we take this term here, RT over ZF, essentially because we're always at constant temperature, as long as we know the charge on the ion, so for example, potassium would be +1, calcium would be +2, essentially, or effectively. What we can do is we can reduce this, what looks like a complicated term, down to a single value. The other thing that's important is this ratio here. So effectively the ratio of the extracellular ion concentration to the intracellular ion concentration. So if we know the concentration of a particular ion inside and outside the cell, we can calculate this term here. And this term here, the ratio of the ion inside to outside the cell, is something called the concentration gradient. And we take the natural log of the concentration gradient in order to work out the equilibrium potential. If we don't know how to take a natural log, and actually more commonly what we use is log to the base 10. And again, without complicating this too much, hopefully, the way you can get from natural log, or you can convert natural log into log to the base 10, is multiply again by a constant value -2.3. So let's go through one calculation and explain this in a little bit more detail. So first of all, what we need to know for any ion to calculate the equilibrium potential is its concentration inside and outside of the cell. So this is a diagram taken from one of the textbooks we recommend and telling you that information. So what we're going to do on the next slide is we're going to calculate the equilibrium potential for this ion here, the potassium ion. So in order to do that, we need to know the concentration outside the cell and the concentration inside the cell. So we can look that up. So for example, for potassium, extracellular fluid contains 4 millimolar or 4 milliliters per litre of potassium. Inside contains 140. So our concentration gradient essentially favours potassium going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. But we'll find out that in other parts of the course. What we're going to use this information for here is to calculate the equilibrium potential for potassium using the Nernst equation. So as we said, it's more usual to use log to the base 10 rather than natural log, so we'll do that here. So if our task is to calculate the equilibrium potential of potassium at our normal body temperature, 30 degrees C, what we can do is we can plug all of the numbers into the Nernst equation and calculate equilibrium potential for potassium, EK. And hopefully, as I said, although this looks a complicated term, if you take the gas constant and the temperature, 37 degrees, convert it into kelvins, we know that the charge on potassium is +1 because it tells us it there, and we know that F is the Faraday constant. So you take all of those values and multiply or times R by T, divide it by Z times F, and we come out of this value here. 26.7 millivolts, or 26.7 times 10 to the minus 3 volts. As I said, we want to times that by 2.3 in order to convert it, or in order to convert natural logs to log. What is important is this concentration gradient. So we show on the previous slide for potassium, 140 inside, 4 millimolar outside, liquid equivalents, same thing. So essentially what we want to do is first of all, we want to divide 140 by 4 and then take the log of that value. If we do that, 140 divided by 4 is 35. The log of 35 is 1.54. And if we times minus 2.3 by 26.7 millivolts, we get minus 62 millivolts. As I said, if we multiply that by the log of 35, you can do this in your calculator, pause the screencast and have a go. The equilibrium potential for potassium comes out at minus 61 times roughly by 1.5, so it's going to be about minus 90, minus 94 to be precise. So this is probably a good place to take a break, but I've calculated the equilibrium potential for potassium using these values from the previous slide and the Nernst equation, and it comes out minus 94 millivolts. What may be a good idea for you guys to do is to try and do it with sodium, calcium chloride, or bicarbonate ions. Pick any one of these, try and plug it in and see if you can come out at this value. The final thing, just maybe to finish the screencast, is just to say that we know that the resting potential, as I said, is around about minus 70. Some of the neurons are a little bit more hyperpolarized, around about minus 90. And the reason for this resting membrane potential is essentially because we use things like potassium in particular, also to some extent some chloride, to set the resting potential. So potassium around about minus 94, chloride around about minus 97. Those are the main ions that we use to set the resting membrane potential. So if we use something like, if we'd evolved to use sodium, then our resting potential would be positive rather than negative. So yeah, like I said, that's a good place to finish this screencast. We'll go on to talk a little bit more detail about the nerve action potential in screencast 3. As I said, maybe for an exercise, what you can do is you can plug some of these other numbers in to this equation here and see if you can come up with plus 61, plus 120, minus 97, minus 30, etc. Okay, so let's finish this one here.